Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure, is sponsored by us. What? We sponsor ourselves? Is that even legal? Check us out on Amazon. You can have access to the titles of Pedagogue, the youth ministry book by Lonnie Jones, Cognitive Spiritual Development, a Christ-centered approach to spiritual self-esteem, Grappling with Life, Controlling Your Inside Space, a small essay using the principles of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to talk about psychological and emotional self-defense, If I Were a Mouse, a children's book written and illustrated by Lonnie Jones, and then The Selfish Rill, a very short story about a decision. Also, you can check out our YouTube channel to see archived lessons and presentations from across the country, some videos with rope tricks and knots. Don't forget to visit the Facebook page 550 Guys to learn about the little rope men that we make and that we invented and that we make. And then be sure to click like, subscribe, and share. This is Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure. Faulkner University introduces the Master of Arts in Christian Counseling and Family Ministry. Many youth ministers are not well prepared for the complex challenges facing youth, parents, and families today. This program is not designed to fulfill any requirements toward becoming a licensed counselor, but it is designed to equip the career youth and family minister to do just that. Minister to families by integrating prevention-oriented counseling skills and intervention strategies within a church setting. The courses include, but are not limited to, counseling skills, counseling couples and families in crisis, family dynamics, human intimacy and sexuality, parent and character education, as well as church assessments. All courses may be completed online from the convenience of your home or workplace and at the time that fits your schedule. Most courses are only 8 weeks long. There is a 60% tuition discount for members of the Churches of Christ. Visit the website faulkner.edu/KGST. KGST stands for Curley Graduate School of Theology. That's faulkner.edu/KGST, or contact Jimmy Holland, Director of Biblical Studies Recruiting, at jholland, HOLLAND, jholland@faulkner.edu with any questions or to find out about the eligibility requirements for the tuition discount. Faulkner University is a sponsor of Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure. I had taught a lot of people to rappel. Well, if not actually taught them, I had exposed them to the sport of rappelling, both in my high school days and in my college days. This is before I was a ropes course owner and operator. This was before I was affiliated with Berry College and their Project Adventure and the Berry Outdoor Leadership, the BOLD program. This was just back in the day when I was only a youth minister and just a chaplain. And I was working with our local SWAT team, and Huntsville City was hosting a regional SWAT school, and they had allowed me to be one of the teachers, and they allowed me to introduce these guys to the rope work. I was going to teach 4 days in a row. I would have one team in the morning. We'd take a break for lunch and one team in the afternoon. And so we were putting on this 4-day SWAT school, and I was getting to teach part of it. Now, this was at the academy at the old airport terminal. This is the airport road location, and we'd be using the fire department's 4-story tower, aka the block building, for our class. The old 4-story concrete cinder block building was replete with cracks, with weathered cinder blocks, with a rusty railing on one side, and poured concrete floors. The anchors we would use were ancient eye bolts that went all the way through the concrete floor and were secured on the underside with plate washers and machine nuts. The anchors we were using were going to be about 2 feet lower than the parapet that we would be standing on to start our rappel. The higher your anchor point is, the easier the transition is when you break from the horizontal plane to the vertical plane. Well, this was about 2 feet lower than we would actually be standing when we started our rappel. So there was going to be an initial fear factor. There's going to be some discomfort, and there's going to be a lot of unknown variables for these guys who had never done any rope work before. And the team had given me free reign to conduct the class as I saw fit. So I would introduce the men and teach them some practical knots, the figure eight. The figure eight on a bind, a clove hitch, would probably teach them just how to tie a bowline knot because that's just standard fare. We would tie our own rappel seats, and then I would teach them how to use the standard or the rescue eight. And we executed the traditional start where you stand up on the parapet and have to lean into an L position and walk off the side of the building. We taught them some rollover entries, some kneeling entries. We taught them an inverted technique that the SR guys call the window peak. And we would even introduce them to Australian rappelling. In one class, we were all circled up at the beginning and we were doing our knots. And I had provided everybody in the group with a short piece of rope, about an 8-foot piece of practice line. And Kerry Robinson was standing in our group and he was holding this 8-foot piece of rope. And one end of his rope was unusually frayed. It was just the sheath had come apart and you could see the core of the rope and it was just fuzzy. And so Kerry's standing there holding these ropes and I was trying to teach. And in that smooth voice that Kerry Robinson had, he goes, "A rope gets onto a bus." And the driver says, "Are you Mr. Roper?" He says, "Nope, I'm afraid not." We survived this humorous volley only to look over and see Kerry standing there again, holding the two ends of his rope side by side. The end that was not frayed was being held lower than the end that was frayed. So like you had these two things standing together and one was taller than the other. And he calmly sang to himself, "I got you, babe." Making fun of the Sonny and Cher program where you had the tall Cher with the fuzzy hair and the short Sonny, and he's doing this with my climbing ropes. I've never doubted my climbing gear. You trust your gear or you don't use it. But when the big deputy from Jackson County, Sonny Goolsby, leaned over the edge of that building and I saw that small 11.4 millimeter rope locked into his toaster sized hands, that's the one time in my life I had my doubts to think, is this really going to hold this mountain of a man? We were all on the tower and the sun was seated. It was sinking in the background. It was cool. I was wearing my Nomex hood ninja mask balaclava for warmth. And as I said, I'd been given free reign and I'd use this opportunity in this class not just to teach the actual rope work, but to try to give them some of my life lessons, kind of like I do, on the podcast, facts, concepts, applications. I would tell them that, hey, when you put a knot in a rope, it actually makes the rope weaker by about 50% for field applications. But if you don't use knots in a rope, the rope is really not useful for anything. And so the very same thing that makes us vulnerable makes us functional. We talked about choosing an anchor point, something to anchor in your life that's higher and stronger than you. And we even talked about the figure eight device and how it uses friction to slow us down and allow us to control our descent. And we talked about the mechanisms we use in our lives to handle friction are very important. The way we choose to manage friction in our life can either burn us up or burn us out. But if we properly handle friction in our lives, we can be slow and controlled and not reactionary. You sort of get the picture. So here we are on top of this tower. The sun's going down and the sky is getting crimson and we're right in that twilight part. And just about the time that kind of stillness settled over, this V of geese circled in low. They were silhouetted against the evening sky. They weren't honking. They weren't making any noise. It was just silent formation of these geese, and they cruised in. They were actually flying below the tower. I looked at the guys on the tower with me. I said, one side of that V is always longer than the other side. And a young officer standing beside me, wrapped up in his rope gear, looked at me and said, "Yeah, why is that?" I said, "There's more geese on that side." And for one brief moment, I thought they might throw me off the tower. I felt a similar reaction when I was speaking at a smaller church and I was standing in the foyer and an older gentleman introduced himself and I introduced myself, said, "I'm Lonnie Jones." He goes, "So, you're Jones. You know why there's so many Joneses in the telephone book?" That's how long ago it was. People knew what a telephone book was. He said, "Do you know why there's so many Joneses in the telephone book?" I said, "No, sir, I don't." He says, "They all have telephones." So here I am, guilty of stating the obvious. 2 or 3 times I've wanted to introduce into the podcast the guys from Obvious Publications. Obvious Publications is a fictitious sponsor of the podcast, and their tagline would be, remember, at Obvious Publishing, we put the O in obvious, and we would highlight some titles like Being Politically Bold as an Entertainer by the Dixie Chicks, The Killer Airbnb Experience by Norman Bates, Establishing Combat with a 360-degree Field of Fire by George Armstrong Custer, The Art of Disguise by Clark Kent, Treadmills, Stationary Bikes, Mops, and Washing Machines, A Gift Buying Guide for Husbands by Newly Estranged, Do-It-Yourself Projects That Look Like a Professional, Jeffrey Epstein and Hillary Clinton, Desserts and Diplomacy by Marie Antoinette, Turning Childhood Trauma into Fame and Fortune by Bruce Wayne, Mentors and Loyalty by Anakin Skywalker, Secrets and How to Guard Them by S.P. Onage, and then Proper Diction by Elmer J. Fudd, forwarded by Barbara Walters. Rebellion, Running Away, and Finding Your Prince, a Disney guide to navigating female adolescence. Among those selected titles would also be When Ice Melts in Your Drink, The Glass Doesn't Overflow, The Climate Denier's Paradigm, Never Let a Lonely Drunk Frenchman Name Your Mountains, A Tourist Guide to the Grand Tetons by Pepe Le Pew, and then my favorite, Grief Counseling by Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar. Well, that's Obvious Publishing. Those are books that when you just read the title, you know that the guys shouldn't be writing those kind of books. Similar to, they all have telephones, and there are more geese on that side, are those things that are so true and so obvious they don't actually require acknowledging, but when you point them out, the result is either a groan because of the bad humor or an epiphany that causes us to say, oh, yeah, that's why that works that way, or that's how that works. That's the whole gig behind Obvious Publishing. Well, here's things that are so obvious, they're not meant to be funny. Polite people have less drama. Competent people aren't afraid of the unknown. People who forgive don't have heart problems. Honest people sleep better at night. Bitterness ruins the flavor of your life. How you treat me says more about you than it does about me. Selfless people are easier to trust. Forgiveness is not what others owe you, but something you can give others. Emotions tell us how you are responding, not how you should respond. And just because something affected you is not permission to let it control you. And by the way, you aren't responsible for the things that you don't control. God uses things he did not cause to bless us. God uses is not the same thing as God caused. And when bad things happen, God has a response, but his response is not the reason it happened. I know we know these things. And these are good things and they are true things. But sometimes they're so obvious, we feel silly when somebody has to point them out to us. They're so obvious, we feel silly when somebody has to explain them to us. In fact, I would go out to say that they are so obvious, they aren't even funny. But it's funny how obvious they really are.